We've already seen two big concerns emerging from the COVID inquiry. Tomorrow, we're expecting to find out more about the deletion of ministers' text messages. What on earth was going on? I'm joined by an expert panel who'll take us through the inquiry's first week. Plus, Northern Ireland finds itself in the middle of a diplomatic spat as the governments in London and Dublin try to manage the migrant issue right in the middle of election season. We'll hear live from Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil and Into. Hello. For some, coronavirus might feel like a distant memory, but others continue to live with the consequences of losing loved ones without fully understanding why. This week, the COVID inquiry's evidence sessions have begun to shed some light into how the crisis was handled here by senior politicians and civil servants. To look back on the first week of revealing evidence, I'm joined now by Sam McBride from the Belfast Telegraph, Enda McGarrity, a solicitor representing the families of those who lost loved ones during the pandemic, and our health correspondent, Mary-Louise Connolly. Welcome to all of you. Mary-Louise, first of all, the evidence of the past few days has highlighted the dysfunctionality at the heart of the executive during COVID. There's a lot more to come, we understand, but of what we've heard so far, what has stood out for you?
What a week, Mark, and it's hard to go past the very first day of evidence when the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Michael McBride, talked about that political dysfunction. We then heard from the former head of the Civil Service, Sir David Sterling, talking about a legacy of mistrust, that ministers had been found wanting, they hadn't shown strong leadership, that they had quickly retreated into community activist mode. Those descriptions of acrimonious meetings, of jockeying for position, that power struggle that emerged today over the position of Robin Swann as Health Minister, then that description of the discernible chill that had descended over the First and Deputy First Ministers, and all of which was against a backdrop of a very strong personal videos from the families where they told their stories. They set out the inquiry with really heart-wrenching stories of people saying goodbye to loved ones through an ICU window. And then within the next half an hour, we got this deluge of criticism about politicians who were making such important decisions about what was happening to us at the start of the pandemic.
Sam, dysfunctional bastards, were you expecting that?
I wasn't expecting that language, I think it's fair to say, but the sentiment, absolutely. I mean, if you think about the RHI inquiry, it was about a green heating scheme, but it was much more than that. It was an inquiry into how we're governed. This is the same. There's a natural human inclination, I think, for a lot of people now to just want to forget about COVID. It's gone, thank goodness, and let's just put that in the past. Even those people ought to be paying attention to this, because this is about how we're governed. And when you look at that stuff about data loss, which I'm sure we'll come on to, it's absolutely shocking. And it's happening now in terms of the people who are now running Stormont. It's happening on their watch. And that's something which I think we should be very, very alarmed about. These are people who said they'd fixed the problems of RHI. Here they're being repeated over and over again.
Yeah, and we will come on to all of that in a bit more detail in just a moment or two. Let me bring Enda in at this point. You represent, as I said, the families. How have they viewed proceedings so far?
Yeah, so it's been a hugely significant week for the families. They've campaigned for this inquiry. It's the first and only time that it'll be sitting in Belfast. So they've been waiting in anticipation for quite a long time for this. They watched on this week with some concern. It's confirmed a lot of their fears about what had been going on behind the scenes in government, and what we really have here is a unique look at the machinery of government during a crisis.
And when they hear, as they have heard, about the dysfunctionality that was the case, the reality behind closed doors, what did they make of that, do you think? I mean, it doesn't exactly help them, presumably.
Absolutely not, and they're very disturbed by that. There was a very helpful summary from Counsel to the Inquiry which set out a chronology of events from January, February and March 2020. And the assumption, there's always been a narrative that the politicians, the decision makers were doing the best that they could with the information they had at the time. Our clients have always questioned that view, and that chronology has really borne out that there was a knowledge of COVID and the dangers that it presented to the most vulnerable people in society. as early as January, but certainly overwhelming evidence in February 2020.
OK, we'll come on to discuss what the families are hoping to get out of the inquiry in a moment or two. Mary-Louise, I want to talk about social care for a moment or two. I mean, care homes, we have seen, and I suppose some people have suspected, were not foremost in a lot of people's minds. What's come out on that you would draw particular attention to?
And that's not just an idea or a presumption or an observation, because we know back in March 2020, those pictures of families standing outside care homes and having to look at loved ones through a window. What we have heard as recently as today from the inquiry, this lack of understanding, this lack almost of awareness of what was actually coming down the track. So I think on one hand we have the machinery of government, but on the other hand we're talking about the COVID inquiry and what preparation was made, what was known in advance about what was coming. Well, we could only have to look at our television screens and see what was happening in China and Italy. But what we've been hearing is that there was communication coming from the Cabinet Office to the Executive, specifically to the Department of Health, with warnings that what was on its way. The question is, how well were we prepared for what was coming down the tracks? And clearly Northern Ireland was not prepared. We heard from Sir David Stirling, we heard from the Executive Office's Chris Stewart, admitting only yesterday and today that Northern Ireland was 18 months behind in its preparation for civil contingencies. We were 4,000 civil servants short. That contingency hub, which focused on preparing for an emergency, whether it be weather, no Brexit vote, and then a pandemic, there were 4 people manning that office on the 8th of March when there should have been 28 people.
Yeah. And Sam, I think people will wonder, and I don't know if they'll get answers to this, but they will wonder why it was, when it was very clear that the pandemic was coming, there was inaction for such a long and apparently long period of time. There was no question about what was going to happen, and yet key decisions were not being taken in a timely fashion.
And some of that, I think it's fair to say, was coming from London. They were getting a steer from London that yes, there was a major crisis coming, but there were mixed messages about how they should respond to that. There were changes of strategy. Boris Johnson was obviously all over the place. There were lots of things going on in London which were impacting us here. But I think more than that, as Mary-Louise has said there was this system of a form of government that was meant to function in a crisis in Northern Ireland. Governments are meant to have these plans, these contingency plans for plague, for famine, for war, for the worst possible things that they hope never happen, but there is a plan, they take it down and they put it into place. They hadn't reviewed their contingency planning here for 20 years, over 20 years. Now, you can't make up that sort of ground in 3 or 4 weeks. So yes, they knew it was coming. They were trying to do what they could, and I think we have to have some charity towards these people. They were doing the best that they could, but it was too late by that stage. Stormont was paying, if you like, and we were paying for the sins of past administrations, past civil servants who hadn't done their jobs properly.
So there was a level, apparently, of incompetence that needs to be addressed. There was a question about transparency, because you've already referenced the fact that ministers' phones have been wiped, Executive Office minutes have been lost, and we also have politicians point scoring when they should have been making important decisions.
Yeah, and constantly over the last couple of days, a running theme has been, I don't know, I'm going to have to refer to my notes about that. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that. So much so that several times, only today, Baroness Hallett, the chair, said, well, I want you to get me that information. We have asked for that information, but time and time again, we hear, sorry, I'm going to have to go back to my notes. They have had months and months to prepare for this inquiry, and still answers aren't being provided.
And Sam, you wrote the book. You literally wrote the book on RHI, and we were told that lessons would be learned after that debacle. But in terms of keeping records and being able to answer the questions which are reasonable under the circumstances you would imagine, the lessons do not appear to have been learned.
I don't see evidence that things have fundamentally changed. And as a journalist, these are stories that people want to read. These are striking stories, dramatic stories. But as a citizen, I'm pretty depressed by this, frankly, because there was all of this effort, all of this expense on the RHI inquiry, tens of millions of pounds, more than 100 days of sittings. And look where we are. In the middle of a crisis where people were dying. It wasn't simply about losing money, and they hadn't learnt the lesson.
And Enda, all of this must be very painful for the families who are watching this evidence, of course, in great detail. Political points going, apparent incompetence, and again, I say, an apparent lack of transparency. That is not what the families want to be seeing and hearing.
Absolutely not. And we heard evidence about in autumn 2020, the DUP exercised a cross-community vote, which was really unheard of in such circumstances in relation to public health in particular, to block the extension of restrictions. So when party politics got in the way of public health considerations, that's of deep concern to our clients. And it's something, and as Sam has touched on, in terms of the enforcement of recommendations and learning from past mistakes, that's something that Northern Ireland bereaved families for justice are very keen to see that this inquiry does, that any recommendations that are made are taken through and that they are implemented by the executive.
Yeah, and at times, Mary-Louise, it appears that the executive was frankly leaking like a sieve. And Baroness Hallett, again, gently, very diplomatically, was making it uncomfortable for some people when she was challenging them on that subject.
Yeah, she was really on the ball, particularly today, challenging why, and almost a sense that she found it really shocking. It obviously goes on in other administrations, but the sense that at that really pivotal time in December, coming up to Christmas and what was coming. And it's very important that the inquiry is telling us this in chronological order, because October, November, December, and just as Enda has described, they're triggering that community vote. We were building up to the biggest death toll in January. So what happened between October, November, December, the leaking of documents, and because so much was being leaked at the time, we were told that Ministers Mallon and the Health Minister Robin Swan were coming very late to the table with documents. It was too late to share these documents with the executive. Meetings were being delayed, also that things weren't being leaked. And this was building up to January 2021, when we had our death toll was vast. And you're wondering, is this where the inquiry is going? They're building up this picture to say, well, look, this is what happened, and then this was the result of your actions.
We should be absolutely honest about this. I mean, journalists like leaks. Of course, journalists like leaks because it allows them to know what's happening inside closed meetings so that they can explain to their readers, their viewers and their listeners.
Those leaks were being played off against political parties.
Yes.
I think that's the point.
No, absolutely that's the point. But I think we just need to put our hands up and say, of course, journalists like leaks. The reality is, though, and this is what was interesting today, that clearly there were mechanisms to prevent leaks from happening, but they were not being properly implemented. I mean, there was almost a shrug of the shoulders. I think it's fair to characterise it in that way, that, well, look, we tried, but we didn't seem to be able to get to grips with it. So we gave up.
Leaking is intrinsic to politics. Almost everybody in politics leaks when it suits their purposes or when they think it's in the public interest.
And it's really important to know that.
I'm not going to criticise people for leaking. And actually, some of the people who were leaking were doing the public a service because they were telling us that what they were being told was lies. They were being told we're all in this together, we're working really hard. It was nonsense. Behind closed doors, the executive was all over the place and they were exposing some of that. So that was important. Yeah. Leaks were a symptom of the problem. They were not the problem. And what we heard today from Jenny Piper, the former head of the Civil Service, was that once things improved in terms of more respect around the Stormont executive table, the leaks fell by the wayside to a significant extent. So I think it's a mistake to focus too much on leaks. Yeah. That was because the system was completely dysfunctional by that stage.
Yeah, but I think that context is very important. It's also important to say, Mary-Louise, that as dysfunctional as our politicians and senior civil servants may have been, you have to concede they were faced with unprecedented circumstances. And it wasn't the civil servants' fault that Stormont had been down for the 3 years immediately before this.
And that is coming out over the last, we're day 3, that dysfunctional politics and the fact that we didn't have an executive and assembly up and running for 3 years. What was the knock-on effect of that? Well, clearly the Bengoa review didn't happen. The Part of the People review, which may have tackled the problems with health workforce, that hadn't been activated either. We'll never know. Hindsight, of course, Mark, is a wonderful thing. But perhaps if those reviews had been in place, the Health and Social Care Service may have been in a better position to tackle what was going on and what was coming into care homes. We know that care homes were nowhere near ready for what was happening. And one of your members, Martina Ferguson, who was a really important voice through all of this, she was telling the media for us to look at documents about visiting care homes, because she said there is a disparity. People can visit their loved ones perhaps in the Moy, but if you live in Banbridge, you can't. But there is a document available, but it's not being passed around care homes. And that was clearly a problem at the time, and we're hearing more and more about that there wasn't a sharing of information.
What about that context from a family's perspective, Enda? The 3-year hiatus that immediately preceded this at Stormont is a factor. Public services were already on a downward spiral, and we were, of course, being governed in early 2020 by a newly established 5-party mandatory coalition. So it was never going to be straightforward. To what extent do you think the families can comfortably factor that in to the reality of what was happening?
Yeah, they absolutely factor it in. I don't think they were expecting perfection. I think what they've come to learn through the inquiry process has shocked them, just at the level of the lack of resilience in the system, the lack of foreseeability that a pandemic on this scale would affect the most vulnerable in society, the elderly and disabled, most significantly. And that information was available early. It was available in January and February, and one would expect that plans would be put in place to protect those most vulnerable. And our clients' concerns is that certainly didn't happen, not only in the initial stages of the pandemic, but also as we came to the end of 2020 and early 2021.
Can I ask you, what do the families, as you understand it, want to come out of the inquiry? Are they looking for apologies? Are they looking for the kind of transparency that we've come to know families to be looking for in Northern Ireland, I suppose in connection with other issues as well? I don't know whether they think they'll get that level of transparency, but is that what they want, just to know what actually happened and why it happened? Is that enough for them?
First and foremost, they want to establish the facts. That's important, and they'll gain answers and accountability through that process. The next stage of that is to effect change. And to do that, they need to take the learning from the inquiry. The inquiry will make recommendations, and those will be put to the executive and to departments. And it's important that those are translated into tangible change. The families are really performing a selfless public service. They've done so with dignity and the ultimate respect for each other in their grief.
So they will want to be satisfied that if something like this was to happen again, the mistakes that were made in 2020, early 2020 in particular, would not be repeated in future.
Absolutely.
OK, but the challenges, and Sam's already touched on this, we thought we'd learned lessons previously, for example, during RHI. And there are many other examples that we could quote where Stormont had difficulties, bumps in the road. We were told things would be put right and lessons would be learned, and it seems that that's not the case.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking to Brenda Doherty, another voice of the bereaved families, as you say, it is selfless action. She says if there is to be a next time or any sort of emergency, she doesn't want her grandchildren, great-grandchildren have to be faced with, you have to choose how many people are going to the cemetery, or that a loved one is buried in a body bag, or that a family is left at a cemetery to watch a cortege, a closed coffin that they haven't seen, the body inside. We never, ever have to go through that again. And steps are taken to ensure, for whatever might be coming our way, maybe, hopefully never, that there is a proper plan in place.
How, Sam, do you think key decision makers can be held to account for the decisions that they took, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic? Because, you know, in the past, they haven't always been held accountable. Let's be absolutely honest. And people will be concerned that we now have a four-party mandatory coalition where there will be bumps in the road in the future, no doubt about that, and they could very quickly revert to type and engage in political point scoring all over again. And the people who lose out, the argument goes in those circumstances, are the ordinary people who live in the society and the people who voted the politicians into office, of course, in the first place.
And that final point that you've made is the crucial one. We are the people who hold them to account as citizens. This is a democracy. It's a cliche, but it's true. We get the politicians we deserve because we pick them. After RHI, there was this period where politicians were frightened. They didn't think that voters would vote on those lines, and suddenly they saw the sands shifting. Then that changed back with Brexit. Things got very tribal. We got into a crocodile election, all of that stuff. If people think that this is something that there's votes in them for, they will pay much more attention as ministers to what the civil servants are up to, what the civil contingencies group is doing. Those are boring aspects of politics. But if we don't prioritise them as voters, we can't expect politicians to prioritise them.
What are you anticipating over the next 2 weeks? Do you think we're going to see more fireworks?
Yes, I think we are going to see other health officials. We know we can't say today that we're going to hear from Richard Pengelly, we're going to hear from the Chief Scientific Advisor and other big political. If you think of those people who spoke to us from podiums, we're going to be hearing from all those people over the next two weeks. And I think the way that the dialogue has been going over the past couple of days, certain names keep being mentioned who council believe have the answers to a lot of these questions.
OK, Sam, in a sentence or two, what are you looking forward to? Or looking out for, maybe I should say.
Jane Brady tomorrow is a key witness. She's the head of the Civil Service. She was the person who said that the Civil Service was on a path of continuous improvement last year. They're not. She's accountable for that. Let's see what she says and let's see how Stormont reacts in holding her to account through Assembly committees and other mechanisms. OK. And Enda, it'll be very interesting to hear from you at the end of the process and hear then what you think the families make of the evidence when they've seen it in its totality. For now, thanks all very much indeed for coming in to join us. Now, let's turn to a story that dominated the news cycle on both sides of the border this week. Dozens of migrants' tents in Dublin city centre made for stark images as the row between the UK and Irish governments escalated. Here's a reminder of how the situation unfolded.
It's clear that people who are applying now, and that number has increased significantly, have come through the borders.
Why is your party leadership using a hard right dog whistle to talk about open borders?
Ireland can't become a casualty because of the horrific Rwanda legislation that the Tories have decided to railroad through.
Whatever the problems of the Irish Republic, they are largely of their own making.
The mishandling of this by your government, by your Taoiseach, has been a gift to the Tories. And if you follow politics over there, as no doubt you do, I have no doubt that you are very well aware of that fact too.
What I am very well aware of is not allowing this country to become a pawn in any politics in the United Kingdom, and I think that's something I hope you and I can agree on.
Well, the House will be aware that we have made commitments to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, and the Honourable Lady makes a very important point that the Irish government must uphold its promises too. We can't have cherry-picking of important international agreements, and so the Secretary of State is seeking urgent clarification that there will be no disruption or police checkpoints at or near the border, and I can confirm that the United Kingdom has no legal obligation to accept returns of illegal migrants from Ireland.
Well, now let's discuss this further with my guests. Fianna Fáil Senator Lisa Chambers, Sinn Féin TD Donncha O'Leary, the N2 leader Peadar Tóibín, and with me in the studio, Professor Colin Murray from Newcastle University. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us on the programme tonight. Lisa Chambers, first of all, that clip of Rishi Sunak having a go at the Irish government over an open border in Ireland just underscores the, let's call it the topsy-turvy nature of this issue. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
No, I mean, it wasn't that long ago when we had a British Prime Minister show no regard for the border in Ireland. And it was the Irish government that, through great efforts over a number of years, ensured that there was no border on the island. So I thought his comments quite frankly, were unbecoming of a Prime Minister in the UK. I thought that he was riding roughshod over British-Irish relations, which, you know, went through a turbulent period during the Brexit process, have recovered. We've seen the institutions in Northern Ireland back up and running. We were back in a good space. And I do think it was deeply regrettable to see the British Prime Minister, it appeared to be part of electioneering, is all I can pull it down to, really been very disrespectful to the Irish government and to the Irish people. And it does appear that he was peddling a migration policy of either to Rwanda or to Ireland. And that's just completely unacceptable from somebody in his position. And I do hope that he reflects on that.
Well, I wonder then if you've seen tomorrow's front page of the Daily Telegraph. The headline is Sunak to offer Ireland chance to join Rwanda scheme. It says, number 10 says it's open to exploring Ireland's participation in the scheme after Irish ministers blamed the deterrent effect of deportation to Rwanda for the surge in asylum seekers arriving in Dublin from Britain. You're not going to tell me, I suspect, that that is respectful of Ireland's position on this issue.
No, and I'm going to assume that Rishi Sunak is an intelligent man. He wouldn't be in the position he is if he were not. And he knows full well that Ireland, as a member of the European Union, we deal with migration at an EU level, and we will not be joining the Rwanda policy for that, not just for that reason. I think the Rwanda policy is cruel. I think it's a blunt instrument. It's had many difficulties getting passage through the House of Lords, and there's a lot of opposition to it. And I think it's morally wrong, the legislation. So, no, we're not interested. And I think the Prime Minister is well aware of where we are in terms of our work at an EU level, and that wouldn't be a runner in any event. But look, I wouldn't expect anything less from the Telegraph to carry such a story, and it's peddling misinformation. And I think it's just trying to play to the base, quite frankly. But all the while, you've got damage being done to the relationship between Ireland and Britain. And whatever Rishi Sunak's personal views are of that relationship, whether he regards that relationship or not, the British people highly regard that relationship, and the Irish people highly regard that relationship. And I think that it's really unfortunate that he would be doing and saying those things.
Let me bring in Donncha O'Leary for a Sinn Féin perspective on this. The Fine Gael Justice Minister Helen McEntee talked about a significant proportion of people coming through the border now from Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland. She said, I would say higher than 80%. Did Helen McEntee's comments make it easy, in your view, for Rishi Sunak to criticise the Irish government?
Well, I think the Irish government have handled this very badly. I think you had the conflict between Minister McEntee and the Taoiseach Micheál Martin in relation to the figures and contradicting themselves publicly. This, I think we should remember, arose from a case in the Irish High Court in relation to Irish legislation. And the proposal is, and certainly from Sinn Féin's point of view, what needs to happen is that legislation needs to be brought forward. The gap needs to be rectified in terms of return arrangements with Britain, and the case needs to be appealed as well, of course. But I think Micheál Martin's comments on Thursday were extremely careless, played very much into Rishi Sunak's hands. And while I wouldn't absolve Rishi Sunak of any blame in this by any manner or means, ultimately the Conservative Party is going to do what the Conservative Party is going to do, and they grabbed it with glee and they made great use of it, and particularly in the week of an election. So I think his comments were careless, and I think the response in terms of the dispute between Minister McEntee and the Taoiseach, should panic at a time that there was calm needed, and there was bumbling at a time when consistency was needed, and indeed conflict between the two of them. That was extremely unhelpful. At the end of the day, what Ireland needs is a number of things. We need our own migration policy that is fair, efficient and enforced. And we need to ensure that there are arrangements with Britain for the return of people where that's appropriate. I believe that can be achieved, but I don't think that the kind of gunboat diplomacy that we saw from both sides during the week will help resolve that in short order.
Well, I suppose it's no surprise that Sinn Féin would be critical as a party on the opposition benches in the Oireachtas of how the government has conducted itself, though I imagine you'd agree with Lisa Chambers on her comments about the Daily Telegraph story that we were just discussing there. But, you know, there are those, your critics will have plenty to say about where Sinn Féin is on this as well, apparently contradictory, because you have a position on the common travel area, you've got a position on open borders. Your party doesn't support the idea of open borders, but, you know, the reality is, as things stand, whether Sinn Féin likes it or not, there is an international border on the island of Ireland, and your critics see contradictions in that position as far as Sinn Féin's concerned, of course.
Well, critics can say what they wish, but ultimately, and of course, you saw Tory MPs coming out with this kind of stuff during the week. And look, that's what they're going to do. At the end of the day, the type of the border is, to some extent, a red herring, because whether there was a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit, or a middling Brexit, there would be a need for a returns arrangement between Ireland and Britain. And indeed, since Brexit, Britain has returned people not only to Ireland, but to Switzerland, Sweden, France, Germany, and a variety of other European jurisdictions. It doesn't have any border at all, any land border with those countries, and it has returned people where that is appropriate. So, ultimately, we could still be having this conversation if Brexit had taken a very different direction. I'm glad that Brexit didn't take the direction it did. It would have done huge damage to Irish society, north and south, and indeed to the economy, north and south. But ultimately, we could still be having the same discussion, and very likely the same case could have been taken.
Let's bring in Para Tabine. Rishi Sunak asks what on one level is a very simple question. Why would the UK take back migrants from Ireland when France won't take back migrants from the UK? Can you see his logic?
Well, I think Rishi Sunak is involved in some world-class trolling at the moment. He's definitely trying to play to the Tory base. He's fighting for his life at the moment in the elections currently in England. So, you know, the common travel area is a shared project with shared benefits and shared challenges. So the logic would be that we would work in partnership in relation to that. I do agree that actually it would be better if the likes of Ireland, Britain and France worked together in relation to this in the first place. But the point is actually historically, the flows of migrants have gone from the south into the north into Britain. So historically, there is, Britain would benefit from working with the southern state at the moment, and flows will change as well. So what we're seeing from the Tories is just short-termism to try and get over the bump of the election in terms of their own future, and that's a problem. So yes, we should be working in partnership, the three countries together. But the truth of the matter is, as well, we do have a Irish sea border for goods at the moment, and the logic of that is that there has to be a border somewhere in terms of goods, and that the border between north and south is unmanageable in terms of trying to create that border there. So I think in the long run, what we need in Ireland is an Irish sea border in terms of people as well. So in other words, if there are migrants travelling from Ireland to Britain or vice versa, that actually their asylum process starts when they land either on the island of Britain or the island of Ireland.
OK, that's an interesting point. Let me bring in Professor Colin Murray at this stage. Just, Colin, if you would talk us through the key problems as you see them here, because I think it is complicated for people to get their heads around. There are a lot of moving parts in this conversation. Is Northern Ireland, first of all, effectively stuck in the middle of a problem that exists between London and Dublin?
Well, Northern Ireland, in terms of these movements of people, always has been in that position, both as a matter of geography and as a matter of politics. But as a matter of law, and, well, the arrangements that spring back to the common travel area, Rishi Sunak standing up in the Commons and saying there are no legal obligations on a returners arrangement is very much the issue. These are two states that have been trying to share sets of immigration arrangements and almost a bubble approach when it comes to movements of people from outside these islands for a century now. And that's never been put on a legal footing because it involves a pooling of sovereignty and a closeness of relations between them. Now, the problem is not putting that on a legal footing means that when it comes to something like a returners arrangement in this situation, things that have happened and worked quite well for a long time now don't work when it's to one side's political advantage to make hay out of that.
So what you're saying is that the common travel area works very effectively when both sides work it effectively, but when one side puts a stick in the spokes of the wheel, then it becomes problematic very quickly, and that's what we're looking at the moment.
And we're looking at a situation where there are general elections coming up both in Ireland and in the UK, and there is an incentive to stick a spoke. We know from the High Court case in Dublin that's been talked about already this evening that there were return arrangements in place, and that the UK was saying it was willing to receive people back from Ireland. That suddenly disappeared. The heavy emphasis in Rishi Sunak's language is on the idea of a legal obligation to make these returns. There's a very clear idea that the Irish government thought that these returns were always going to happen.
What do you make of Peadar Tóibín's suggestion there of a three-country approach, Ireland, Britain and France, working together as one to try to deal with this issue? Is that a runner?
Well, there's the same issue that comes almost from the UK's proposal this evening, as floated in the Telegraph with regard to Ireland. There's an effort to deal with things bilaterally that cut across a lot of Ireland and France's obligations as EU member states. Trying to bring Ireland, say, into the Rwanda scheme ignores Ireland's obligations under the EU Trafficking Directive. These things cannot be wished away. And there's an idea that, well, senior figures in the UK government still don't understand, even after all these years, what it is to be a member state, if they're thinking that that's a real runner for Dublin.
Let me bring back Senator Lisa Chambers again. I just want to talk about the young men who were in that encampment, if we describe it as that, in central Dublin until 24 hours ago when they were moved. These are young men who've been moved forcibly to City West Hotel outside Dublin and to a disused military camp in the Dublin mountains, where we're told their accommodation is better than it was in central Dublin and Mount Street. What happens when more migrants potentially arrive next week and more arrive the week after that?
Yeah, look, the people that were camping there in Mount Street is where the office is, where people present to claim asylum. There were some tents erected around that area. It was not suitable. There were no toilet facilities, no showers, no food provision. So those individuals were moved to more suitable locations where there are facilities, you know, in terms of places to charge your phone, a recreation room, food provision, toilets, showers, all of the essentials. So also bearing in mind as well that, you know, there are people living and working in that area. So that was another reason why it just was not an appropriate space, because it was just basically erecting tents on footpaths. But look, the migration challenge is a shared challenge. There is a common travel agreement in place. The Irish government has been very clear. We will live up to our side of the agreement, and we expect the UK government to do the same. And for the long term, this is a challenge that will be with us for the long term. And it's not sustainable to have the UK and government and the British Prime Minister saying that he's, you know, not interested in working with Ireland or not interested in living up to the agreement that is in place. I just don't think that's a sustainable long-term position for him to take. And it may very well be that those comments were made in the context of elections. I certainly hope that he'll reflect and maybe calm down a little bit and think about the long-term implications of his decisions and his comments, because you know, prime ministers come and go, governments come and go, but the relationship between our two countries will prevail and will persist because it matters to people. And I think that needs to be remembered.
Can I ask you, Donogh O'Leary, should the forces of law and order, should Gardaí be endeavouring at any time to stop migrants moving from Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland? Should that ever be the case in your view?
Look, I mean, I think even if you wanted to do that, you couldn't possibly do that. I think with the size of the border and the various crossings and so on, even if you're so minded, and I would not be, to do that, I don't think that would be possible, particularly in the context of the common travel area and all that we've tried to achieve in terms of that. I think, look, the key bit is to try and restore arrangements for return where appropriate between Ireland and Britain. I think that can be done. Fixing the legislation domestically here is the first thing, and that's what the government's first focus should be on, as well as the appeal. More generally, in my view, what is needed is a migration system that's fair, that's decent, that's efficient and enforced, and where decisions are made quickly. Too often, decisions are not made quickly enough and they're not enforced, and that is a significant problem. So that is something that needs to be grappled with on a southern level. I just pick up Patter's point as well, and obviously nobody would be surprised to hear me say that, obviously a United Ireland would solve a great deal, but we know that that's not going to happen overnight. I would say, though, that in terms of goods, while Brexit has made it challenging, we do want to see as easy a movement as possible east-west as well, because that's in the interest of the Irish and the northern economy as well.
OK. Just briefly, Peadar Tabine, if you would, when there were initial reports that the Gardaí were going to patrol the border, and for clarity, those reports have since been rubbished, Stephen Farry of the Alliance Party tweeted, "There have already been many complaints of racial profiling on checks on buses and trains. Surely such new measures risks making this much worse." Is that a concern that you have? If that road was to be gone down at any stage, it would cause more problems than it would solve?
See, I don't think there's anybody in the southern state that actually wants to police the border at all, and I don't honestly think it's a goer. I don't think it's of any interest, and I actually think it's trolling by the likes of Rishi Sunak to plead with the southern government to do something that he knows that they're not going to do anyway, to be honest. I think the key issue for the south here is, at the moment, is that we have a system that is compassionate, but there's common sense, and we do have to start to become stricter in terms of how we deal with migration ourselves. We need to make sure that it is sustainable into the future. And we need to make sure as well that, the British government don't seek to push flows of people in our direction. And that is not sustainable for the southern state, and it's not sustainable for the relationship we have with Britain.
OK, we need to leave it there. We're out of time. I suspect this is an issue that we're going to come back to time and again. For now, thank you all very much indeed for joining us on the programme. I will be back with Sunday Politics this weekend at 10 o'clock on BBC One. And if you're taking part in the Belfast Marathon, good luck. And you can catch up on both Sunday Politics and The View on iPlayer at your leisure. For now, though, from everyone in the programme, thanks for watching. Have a good night. Bye-bye.